and welcome to our BYG Fall Kickoff video series. We'll be releasing a few videos each week, highlighting the lesson, highlighting the text that we're going to study, and you will watch these videos at home or with your small group, and then we'll meet virtually to talk about some questions, dissect some of what the themes that we're talking about, and then hopefully share some life together as well. But I want to get started. I want to give an intro video as to what book of the Bible we're studying, give some background to that book so that you have a better understanding of what we're talking about, what Paul's talking about as he writes to this church in Colossae, and then how to apply that better to our context today, living in the 21st century. So, like I mentioned, maybe you picked up on it, we're going to be studying the book of Colossians. Now, Paul wrote this letter to the church of Colossae, but it's interesting, he never actually visited. He didn't plant the church in Colossae. So as we go through this, we're going to answer a few basic questions. Some of them are very obvious, some of them not so obvious. But I want to explain why we are here. Why are we studying the book of Colossians? The book of Colossians gives a special attention to the person of Jesus Christ and the results of his life, death, and resurrection. It also highlights the supremacy of Christ and his rule in heaven and earth. He talks about what he has done for his people, made them new together in Christ. And Colossians fits well in the framework of God's plan to redeem his whole creation, or as Paul put it in the Colossians 1, his plan to reconcile all things to himself. Now, the big question is, who wrote the book of Colossians? The easy answer is Paul, as Paul does align a lot with some other letters from Paul, right? Paul ministered to many cities, written them letters like the letter to the Colossians to encourage them and remind the new believers of who Jesus was and what he accomplished on their behalf. Timothy is a mentee of Paul, a young pastor who helped Paul author this letter to the Colossians and served as a secretary in the process. While there are some scholars who doubt the authorship of Paul, the letter's language, style, and theology suggest that with most scholars that Paul indeed wrote Colossians. Another question we might ask is, when and where was this letter written? While we can't be certain about the date or location, most people agree that it's written between AD 60 and 62, based on some of the information from Ephesians and Philemon. As Paul tells Colossians in Colossians 4:3, he wrote this letter while in prison in Rome. The church in Colossae was founded near AD 52 when a Colossian named Epaphras heard Paul preach the gospel in Ephesus. He then went home to Colossae and shared the gospel, the good news of Christ, with his hometown, and which resulted in the birth of the church of Colossae. Epaphras was most likely with Paul in Rome, and he warned him that the church in Colossae had fallen under dangerous teaching. And so obviously to whom this book and this letter was written is kind of the obvious answer, right? It was written to the church in Colossae. The Colossians were mostly Gentiles, but had Jewish and non-Christian spiritual influences in their society. Sound familiar? We have quite a bit of that today too, causing them to question the validity of the gospel of Jesus. Now, the big question is, why was this written? Why would you write a letter to a church that you've never been to, you have no personal connection with? Well, we know Paul's heart for the church, but Paul wrote this letter in response to the reports of false teaching in Colossae regarding our and the humans' ability to control the forces of evil. Paul uses this letter to warn the Colossians of this false teaching, to encourage them in the truth of the gospel, and to instruct believers how to press on in their walk with Christ. According to one commentator, this spiritual guide probably claimed to have that infiltrated the church in Colossae, probably claimed to have insight into spiritual realm and was advising false practices to ward off evil spirits. Another commentator tells us that most likely the false teaching was a blend of Jewish and Hellenistic, which is Greek teaching, the sort of teaching that attracted that first century people, right? The first century was very, very spiritual. And so they were very in tune to spiritual things. And so it's very likely they were swayed easily by some of the spiritual things. Today, we don't really deal as much with the spiritual. We're very more materialistic and earthy in our thinking. Physical science, prove it, facts. But back then, they were more easily swayed by spirituality and spiritual teachers. And so to combat these false teachings, Paul uses this letter to remind the Colossians of Christ's ultimate victory over the forces of evil. Paul longs to see these new believers that Jesus is greater than any spiritual practice, and he is the Lord over all creation. So there's going to be three main themes that we're going to see throughout the book of Colossians. The first one is Jesus is Lord over all creation and rules over all human and cosmic powers. There's no one greater than Jesus. There's nothing that surprises Jesus, and he holds everything together. Right? Paul emphasizes Christ's rule over both the physical and the spiritual realm. Only Christ, the creator and sustainer of the universe, has victory over spiritual forces of evil, as well as his earthly creation. The second theme is believers are called to grow in maturity in Christ by putting off sinful practices and putting on Christian virtues. Right? Paul looks at the believer to put on the new self once they are in Christ, and Paul encourages new believers in Colossae to continue to grow in maturity in their faith rather than giving into the lies of this false teaching. And finally, the third theme we're going to see is just as believers are called to share in Christ's death and the cross by putting off and putting to death their former selves, those who are called they're also called to the joy of sharing in his resurrection and new life. The Colossians book, the letter, focuses on what it looks like for Christians to die with Christ, as well as what it looks like to be raised with him. This involves growing in knowledge of Christ, being steadfast in prayer and thanksgiving, and maintaining a godly order in the household. So I hope you're excited as I am to dive into this letter, to look at the book and learn what we can learn, what God would have us to learn about how to interact with false teaching. Every day we are bombarded by false teaching, the temptation to buy into the lie that we can somehow control our destiny by whether being good enough or doing enough good things, or even knowing that Jesus is in control, right? We can buy into the lie that nothing's good, it's all chaos. But to know that and be reminded that Jesus is in control, that he is supreme over all things, and the encouragement to grow in maturity in Christ and remaining steadfast in our walk with the Lord. I look forward to this journey together. I hope you do too. I hope this video has been helpful, giving you some background information on the book of Colossians.